If you're an author or plan to be one, get excited because this podcast is for you. Book Marketing Mentors is the only podcast dedicated to helping you successfully market and sell your book. If you're ready for empowering conversations with successful marketing mavens, then grab a coffee or tea and listen in to your host, international best-selling author Susan Friedman.
Welcome to Book Marketing Mentors, the weekly podcast where you learn proven strategies, tools, ideas, and tips from the masters. Every week, I introduce you to a marketing master who will share their expertise to help you market and sell more books. Today, my special guest is Megan Dougherty. Megan is a digital marketing strategist with a background in online business development and course creation. She co-founded One Stone Creative in 2017, bringing together content marketing strategy and broadcast audio experience to create high-value podcasts for business owners and authors. In 2020, One Stone Creative developed the business podcast blueprints and built podcastingforbusiness.com to help companies and executives to dial into the specific ways they can leverage a podcast. Megan, I am so excited to welcome you to the show, and thank you for being this week's guest expert and mentor.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm so excited about the conversation we're about to have.
Oh, and I am too, because you and I had a little, before the on-air conversation, and you dropped a phrase in or a word, two words, and I'm like, we are going there. And those two words are pod curious. I love that. What does it mean?
Pod curious is when someone is typically a business owner and they are aware of podcasts. They probably listen to a lot of podcasts and they're thinking to themselves, should I have one of these? And when you're in that sort of thinking about it, maybe someone's told you, hey, you should have a podcast. That's what you're in we call it the pod curious phase. And it's when you should really do the exploration and the strategic thinking about whether or not a podcast is going to be a good fit for you, your book, and your business.
And I love that because it is a conversation that I have with many of my authors because they don't know, should they have a podcast? Should they be a guest on a podcast first? Why don't you address that? Because I know you work with a lot of authors, helping them with podcasts. So if an author comes to you with that dilemma, should I have my own or should I be a guest on other people's shows first? What would you say to them?
Well, the first thing I always say is why? What would a podcast do for you and for your business? Because, with the technology that we have available right now, with all the education that there is available right now, anyone can start a podcast and fairly quickly, and you can experiment with, a reasonably low budget. But podcasting well and podcasting strategically, as you know, Susan, is a really big investment of time and energy and sometimes money. If someone is thinking, maybe I should podcast, the first thing they should do is decide, what is the purpose of a podcast going to be for my book, for my marketing funnels, for my business? And if they've never done any kind of media work at all, then starting as a podcast guest is an amazing way to see if you like the format, if you can stand the sound of your own voice, and if you like the way that kind of media gets into the hands and the heads of other people.
You said something that hit home for me because I remember early on, it was really hard for me to listen to my own voice. Now I'm used to it 8 years later, but it was really, really tough. I like the fact that you say that because yes, there is that learning curve. I worked with John Lee Dumas and he took me through his program. I had a mentor and it just evolved. But I know that I wanted to do it for visibility and getting my name out there in the book marketing environment, because even though I'd had my publishing company for 25-ish years by that time, I wasn't known so much in the book marketing space. I wanted that visibility. Yes, let's go and talk about some of the benefits that an author could have by hosting their own show.
And the benefits are many for having a podcast. And the way I like to think about it and sort of figuring out what are the benefits going to be for me, as an individual author, not so much in generalities, is where does my book exist kind of in my business? Or, is it the launch pad for a business that I'm building? And then what path is a stranger going to take to get to me, where my book lives, where the podcast lives, and how those are going to work together? What happens what we see with a lot of authors, especially when they are kind of starting a new project, maybe a new business or a new direction in their lives by writing this book. It's a big piece of pillar content. It's wonderful. Take a stance, get your message out into the world content. But it doesn't necessarily have kind of the intimate connection that you get when you hear someone's voice in your head, or if you're doing a video podcast when you can see them. There's that extra layer of connectivity. And, I'm sure you've heard that on the parasocial relationship that develops when you get that audio experience with someone. It's closer, it's more intimate. An experience that a lot of people have that is really interesting. I've had it. Maybe you've had it, Susan, is you'll meet someone, say at a conference or an event, and they're going to talk to you like they've known you forever. And you're just like, I've never met this person, but they've been listening to you every Thursday night while they cook dinner for the last 3 years. And you're their friend. And so you can take someone on this journey, say they buy your book and they like what you have to say. And so they're going to Google you, they're going to go to your website. Oh, great. It's got a podcast. Well, I'm going to listen to that podcast, and then they're going to get to know you. And that builds the knowing and liking and trusting. It kind of fills a gap for authors in between what they want to be doing for their business, whether it's speaking or coaching or selling services, and that initial impression somebody might have gotten them, maybe hearing them on another podcast or buying their book or seeing them at a conference. It just nurtures that person to know and like and trust you more. So that, I think, is one of the biggest benefits that authors can get without even getting into all the details of getting to explore your topic further, getting to network with other experts and grow your audience that way. I could go on for a really long time, but I know our time is limited today, so I'll leave it there.
I like what you said there, because interestingly enough, it's grown on me. I mean, if I listen, which it would be really hard for me to listen to those first few episodes because some of them were not good. And not necessarily from my standpoint, I just had the wrong guests. I had guests who I had to keep asking questions. It became like an interrogation that, they didn't talk. Yeah. Now I'm much more picky about who I have on the show, because there's a certain type of personality now who I really enjoy interviewing. You're a prime example, because I can ask a question and you're going to give me, a substantive answer rather than one word.
Those interviews can be brutal. And for any of the pod curious or the new podcasters, your first episodes are going to suck. Because it's a skill. You have to build the skill. And the only way to do it is to do it. Like, the only way out is through. So you've got to get those initial episodes out of the way. You have to talk to the wrong people. You have to use the wrong mic setting. You have to lose that entire recording. It's all going to happen.
Yes. And I can verify that. And you can do a whole podcast and find out that you hadn't recorded it too.
Oh,
I've done that a few times.
That hurts.
Very
and
much
it's
so.
Almost always going to happen with the highest profile guest that you've ever had.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, they're very sympathetic to that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you're going to have those teething problems along the way with all different things. Yeah. I mean, I know I've had guests who, in the middle of an interview, then suddenly the dog's barking like crazy outside and they have to say, oh, hold on a minute. I've got to go and take care of the dog. Okay, then.
Yeah, not ideal, but at least some of that you can fix in post.
Exactly. That's why mine are recorded rather than live interviews, because you just never know what's going to happen live. We've had people who've lost power. I've had people in the middle of an interview, their power went. They're very embarrassed when that happens, but it could happen the other way around. I don't want that to be the case. However, that's outside of my control, whether or not the power is going to go out. But these things do happen. An author hosting their own podcast, why would that be different from any other podcast? What makes an author having a podcast special?
It's the book. Not everyone who has a podcast has that kind of a resource to add into their marketing funnel. One of the reasons I really love working with authors, there's a lot of reasons I love working with authors, but it can be special for them because they've got the book that they can either use it to direct people to the podcast, so book to podcast as part of the engagement funnel, or they can go podcast to book and get people who really like what they're saying on the podcast to buy that book. Another benefit, or another thing that's special for them, is that and tell me if I'm wrong about this, Susan, but when you write a nonfiction book, I'm going to put out there and guess that you don't include absolutely every single opinion that you have, or include quotes from every single expert that you've ever talked to, or fully explored every idea to the completest extent possible. All of that went into the preparation and the writing of the book that didn't maybe make it into the final cut, that's amazing podcast content. And that's content that your readers, people who have read your book, are going to absolutely love, because that's the behind the scenes, that's the insider, that's the continuation of the story. So I absolutely love it for that reason. And I also know authors who basically run down their table of contents. They look through their book and they're like, I have 8 other things to say about this. I've got 12 other things to say about that. I've got 3 experts I'd like to interview about this topic. And there's their content calendar for the entire year. The work is practically done already. And that is something that if you don't have that kind of foundation of a big pillar piece of content, you have to do manually bit by bit. And that work can be good and fun and valuable, but authors have already done it. So why not use that when creating this new form of media? So those are a couple of the reasons I really like authors as podcasting clients and listening to their podcasts. It really gives me a closer feeling of the authors that I listen to who have podcasts. It's just that extra step of closeness that makes me feel really good about knowing them and getting to engage with them.
Yeah, and you're right, because your initial draft could be like War and Peace, and nobody's going to read that. 300 pages these days is a lot for a nonfiction. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know fiction books that are 1,000+ pages. My son-in-law reads sci-fi books that are over 1,000 pages. I was like, oh my goodness, I couldn't do that.
For me, it's the Swords and Horses ones.
Yeah. But for a fiction book, yes, you don't want it to be too much and too involved, because you're going to lose people unless you're talking to scientists and high-tech people who really love the data. But for the most part, people just want something that's easy to read and yet get some good information, valuable information, because obviously that's why they bought the book in the first place. But yes, you've got lots of research that you've done and that gets cut. I mean, it's like a movie. I mean, you're going to take a lot of footage that just lands up on the cutting room floor. So the same happens with books. It's just the editor who's like, yeah, we can dispense with this. This is far too much. Yes.
Yeah. I've talked with people who, in the preparation for their books, they interviewed 25, 30, 35 experts to get quotes and to get stories, to get views. That's a podcast for half a year if you want to do a weekly show. If you kept those recordings and you can repurpose them, it really is about using what you have, and authors have so much.
That begs the question, do you have a solo where it's just you, or do you have an interview podcast, like this style?
Mm-hmm. That for me depends a little bit on sort of the ultimate goal of the podcast. And we were chatting a little bit before we hit record about how challenging a solo episode can be to create, because it really is a difficult thing to turn on your mic, have a screen in front of you, maybe a camera in front of you, and then just talk for 20 minutes. That's a very, very long 20 minutes. And not everyone can present themselves really, really well during that amount of time. An interview can be a lot easier. There's two-way dialogue. There's a dynamic flow of conversation and words going back and forth. But as I think you've noticed, I know I've noticed, boy, do people like those solo episodes best of all, because it is you as the author and as the podcast host that people want more of. So when you're making the decision, what format should my podcast take? I like to bring it back down to, what is the goal I want to achieve with the podcast? Do I want to sell more books? Well, in that case, I probably should do more solo content if I'm going to be getting people to go from stranger to podcast listener to book buyer. But if you're trying to, say, launch a speaking career or to maybe set up a new coaching practice, then having interviews can do a number of things for you. Not only is it going to be a more fluid, natural sound in the conversation that you're having, but you're also expanding your professional network. You're meeting all of these people who can help you achieve these other goals. You're bringing insight to your audience. So you've already got a big audience. Tons of people bought your book. And now you want to continue to engage them so that they want to do other kinds of business with you. So you bring in experts that can share things that you don't know personally. And you're doing that as a service to your audience while creating this amazing content. The question is really, what's my specific goal for this podcast within my business and within kind of the marketing ecosystem that I'm building? And what's the format that's going to help me best achieve that goal? And that can be a really individual thing. It's a personal choice and a business strategic decision that needs to be made at the beginning of every podcaster's career.
Yes, and I knew that I wanted to do interviews. I just love interviewing. And as you said, when I do a solo, I get far more interaction where people say, "Oh, I love that podcast. I love what you shared." It's that happy medium. I find it really challenging to sit down for 20 minutes, as you said, and rant about some topic. As my listeners know, that when there is a solo episode, that I actually have my dear friend Jane Malucci who interviews me. I find that so much easier. Yeah, the tables are turned. She asks the questions, and then I just hopefully give some sensible answers.
I love that strategy. It's such a good way to kind of take advantage of the best of both worlds there. I think it's great.
Yes. I mean, my decision, as I think I mentioned earlier, I don't know if I mentioned it already on here, was that I wanted visibility in the book marketing arena. I was not known 8-10 years ago in this field, and I thought having a podcast would be really nice. Yes, I went that route, and I'm thrilled I did. And like you said, we're on 400 and I don't know, this will be probably 420-ish episode, and all the people I've met doing this. Now, I've interviewed lots of my own colleagues, speaker colleagues. I'm a member of the National Speakers Association, and so I know a lot of speakers. Some of them are good and some of them are not so good as guests. However, I know that, I can pick and choose, but I also am looking at a lot of experts. And when I attend summits, let's say online summits, I look at the speakers and think, ooh, that's a topic that I would like to cover. Let me listen to this person. Are they engaging? And, I make some decisions on inviting people who have never heard of me. And up until that point, I had never heard of them. As I say, I've met some incredible people. This for me has been, I just love it. I love it. And the more I do it, the more I love it. I have relaxed so much more too doing it, which helps as well.
And that takes some time as well. It can feel a little awkward those first couple of episodes. And I love what
more
you're
than
saying.
A couple.
I love that strategy of using it as a networking tool at that kind of event. Sometimes we call podcasts the magic calendar opener. And someone who might never give you the time of day, if you wanted to pick their brain or have a virtual coffee, if you say, "Would you like to be on my podcast?" They say, "Absolutely, my assistant will be in touch." And it's a really good way to build that foundation of a different kind of relationship, whether it's, referral partners, maybe even collaboration or joint venture partners. You can do tons of different things when you have podcasting as part of this nurturing and get to know you sequence.
Yes, I absolutely agree, because there have been some high profile people who I've interviewed, and I just said those magic words. I would love to have you as a guest expert on my show. Oh, yes, they're right at that.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, that's an invitation, as you said, that gets scheduled. So it's a great entree. So listeners, if this is something you want to do, I've got lots of techniques that I can share with you about how I find guests. And, I get pitched, 2 or 3 times a week sometimes from agencies now. "Oh, my client is going to be, perfect for your show." And I read what they send me and I'm like, "You have never listened to my show. I
So easy to
don't
tell.
feature just because you've written a book. I don't feature you." Many people don't have a book who I talk with, but they've got an expertise in a subject that is helpful to my listeners. And so that's why I interview them, not because they've got a book.
Those pitches that come out, they're canned, they're done in a spray and pray fashion. I get them all the time too. So I've got a podcast about podcasting for your business. That's pretty much the only thing that we talk about. And so I get pitches all the time from someone who's like, even they'll be like, "Oh, this is a great author. He's got this wonderful entrepreneurial journey. They can help you save all these costs in your business." It's like, that's not what my show is about. And especially as a newer podcaster, it can be difficult to sort through like the wheat from the chaff in those kind of positions, because there are agencies that do a great job really researching, finding great fits. and, placing guests in a way with lots of integrity, but it can be really hard to sort through them.
Recently, we introduced a interview submission form. So when somebody writes to me and I think they may be of interest, then I send them the submission form. And on that form, it says, have you listened to the podcast? And if so, which is your favorite episode? It's usually the most recent one that they find. It's like,
Come on,
yes,
guys,
okay.
let me scroll down a little.
So I have to laugh when they do that. And I do give them the benefit of the doubt. And of course, I love it when a guest has listened to at least one show to get a sense of my style, or even the PR agency, if they are familiar at least with the show. But as you say, they give you canned pitches and it's a numbers game. You throw enough spaghetti against the wall, some of it's going to stick. So, yes. I'm just one of the pieces that didn't stick sometimes.
For those listening, pitching yourself as a guest is, as I'm sure you know, a great strategy for testing the waters, for getting eyes and ears on your book. A nice kind of way to get those pitches accepted and noticed as not garbage. Look at the episode titles of the show that you're pitching and suggest a couple of titles in the format that they most regularly use for the thing that you want to talk about. That demonstrates that you do know the show, at least you've researched it, and you've got some interesting things that are going to fit in with their content. It really will dramatically increase your acceptance rate for getting accepted as a guest on other shows.
I love that. That's a super tip. That was worth everything. How can you tell if a podcast is successful? I mean, yes, there are numbers, but are there other sort of pointers that can give you suggestions whether it is successful or not?
This is possibly my favorite topic of all podcast-related topics. And I'm so sorry to have to tell you, the answer is it depends. Because the way you can really tell if a podcast is successful for your business is if you are regularly making progress towards meaningful goals in a way that you can measure. Let's say that I have a podcast and my goal is to increase the opportunities that I have to be a guest and to be a presenter and just to speak on other stages. If that's one of the reasons that I'm podcasting is to develop those relationships, to develop that body of work that I can reference, and to demonstrate my expertise such that people are going to want me to come talk to their audiences, what I'm going to track is how often, since I've started my podcast, I'm getting those opportunities. And if I see that since I've started the podcast and I've promoted it and I've, dropped links in the inboxes of the right people, that I'm getting asked now on, an average, twice as much as I was before I started my podcast. Well, then I'm going to call that podcast a success. And I'm going to watch how that number changes over time. And as long as I keep podcasting, keep optimizing the way I talk about the show, the way I kind of present the show on my website to achieve more of those opportunities. And there's all sorts of different ways you can optimize for different things. But maybe as another example, if I'd like to meet more people who might send me referrals for my business, that's the main driver of my business is getting referrals. So I'm going to use my podcast as a relationship building tool to meet the type of people who work with my type of clients and hopefully build a good enough relationship that we can send referrals back and forth. And so I'm going to look at over time, which of my guests sent referrals, how many they sent, and how many I was able to send to them. And if I'm seeing that I'm getting more referrals now that I'm podcasting and meeting people in this way, then I'm going to call that podcast a success because it's achieving the goal that I set for it. And it's helping my business in a way that I can track and see changing over time so that I've got the data I need to make decisions about it. There's nothing really completely external that's going to tell you this podcast is successful, this one isn't, unless you just want to count downloads. And downloads can be useful, but they're really not that useful to the bottom line unless you're trying to get sponsors. It comes down to what's the value of the podcast to your business and to your book and to your career. And is it adequately performing its job in supporting that business?
You said a word that I got to pick up on very briefly. I know it's probably not a brief conversation, but give it a try. And that was the word sponsorship, because that's been sort of the bane of my life, but my podcast life. It's like, should I have sponsorships or not for my podcast? And I've had varying different opinions on that. So what's yours?
Almost never as a business. When you're podcasting in support of a business that already exists, and you've got a 30-year-old publishing company, right? You've done all of this work. You've built up this really robust company, and you've got now over 400 episodes of a podcast talking about you and your expertise. Why would you want to share that spotlight or send any of that attention to Casper mattresses for $25 a month? The podcast that you've built is in service of your business. Your business is the client of your podcast, effectively. And so the podcast should be supporting it. And any of the glory and the fame and the shining and the great reputation, you should be keeping that for yourself. You've earned it. I mean, there are cases when sponsorship can help defray the cost of production. And there are podcasts that exist only to make money by sponsorship. But for most business owners, for most people who have taken the trouble to write a book to support their business or to get their idea out there in the world, sharing that spotlight is not necessarily the best strategic decision, especially at the rates that they're likely to be able to get for it.
That response just warms my heart. It really does. I think I'm going to put that one to bed, that it's like, okay, let's look at this differently.
By Aviva Publishing. The show can be presented by. Yeah, so
it is.
Then that's all the sponsorship you need. You're your own sponsor.
Exactly. That's the direction I've definitely gone now, because it does make sense, but I'd just never seen it or heard it like that before. It was a way of, you're looking at monetizing, and how do you monetize it? Do you bring other people in? But there are other ways to do it. So yes, I love that. This is the point in the show, Megan, where I say, how can our listeners find out more about you and the wonderful services that you provide?
The very best way to find out about us is to go to podcastingforbusiness.com. That's where we've got all of the information about everything that we do, our production, different trainings that we do, our annual conference that we run in the fall. It is all at podcastingforbusiness.com.
Perfect. Excellent. And I'll put that in the show notes so that people can just click the link and head over to your site and find out more about your brilliance. Talking about that, we always end off with our guests leaving our listeners with a golden nugget. What's your golden nugget?
I'd say my golden nugget when it comes to podcasting as an author is give it a try, but start small. So if you're feeling pod curious, and if you think you might like to use this as a strategy for your business, start with a short season of a podcast. You can do 6, 10, 12 episodes, make something that's complete and finished by itself. If you enjoyed it, if you had a great time, if you had a great experience with it, good reaction from your audience, keep it going. Start it again. Make it an ongoing show. And if you didn't like it, if it didn't work, then you didn't pod fade. You didn't give up. You didn't fail. You completed a season that stands alone. So start small.
Beautiful. I love that verbiage. You didn't fail at it. Yes, you had one season. That was it. I mean, there are many shows on TV that have one season. Wonderful. Thank you, Megan. This has been a delight. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom. And by the way, listeners, if your book isn't selling the way you wanted or expected to, then let's you and I jump on a quick call together to brainstorm ways to ramp up those sales, because you've invested a whole lot of time, money, and energy, and it's time you got the return that you were hoping for. Go to bookmarketingbrainstorm.com to schedule your free call. In the meantime, I hope this powerful interview sparks some ideas you can use to sell more books. Until next week, here's wishing you much book and author marketing success.